Welcome back to our panel discussion, Navigating Cloud Choices in the Federal Government, sponsored by QTS on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Our guests today are Dave McComber, the Executive Vice President of Public Sector and Federal at QTS. Todd Simpson is the Chief Information Officer at the Food and Drug Administration. And Bill Zielinski is the Deputy Assistant Commissioner for IT Category Management at the General Services Administration. I am your moderator, Tom Temin. And let's talk about something that is really important to the federal government and all of the IT activities, investments being made, and that is really two things, but they're kind of both halves of the same piece. One is modernization of legacy IT, which we discussed briefly in the beginning of the webinar, but also, and going along with that, is lowering the operations and maintenance costs for legacy systems, that starve money that agencies would otherwise have for new innovative types of things. Bill, I think that's implied the ability to change that ratio in all of the cloud activity, but maybe tell us what the latest thinking is and how that's working here in 2017.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. The one part, having worked closely with the prior federal CIO, Tony Scott, as they formulated their plans in and around modernization, one of the things they're really looking for here, and we've touched on it earlier, is that when we talk about modernization, this is not just swapping out the underlying technology and simply rehosting or moving, but it really is fundamentally looking in a very different sort of way at how you architect, design, build, and move forward with your IT enterprise. Todd talked about this idea of a technology roadmap and knowing and understanding kind of where you're going yourselves with technology, but that's being informed by what's happening in the broader market itself. So one of the things that we really have to look at is, as we're making that move and that shift, we really are looking at the entire application stack and what the ramifications for are that, because if you're not making that change to your overall application stack, then you really are just buying a different version of the same problem here. So I think from that modernization perspective, you're really looking to take advantage of what cloud can do for you, so that when you go through that next cycle, the next major changes in what you're doing from a technology standpoint, you're not buying off the entire thing that we're looking at with a set of legacy systems today, where you're having to look at your entire technology stack. You're really able to modernize in a much more agile sort of way, and I think that's the important key for folks is looking at how they design and architect in this period of modernization that we're in now.
Yeah, Todd, because you mentioned the whole idea of digital services is where you need to go, and that doesn't always go hand in hand with legacy COBOL applications.
So I think that from a digital transformation standpoint, it becomes very complex when you have lots of different customers wanting to reinvent themselves in their own areas because they're trying to accomplish some kind of mission critical activity, and so I think the challenge really becomes just bringing everyone together and getting everyone on the same sheet of music and pointed in the same direction from a modernization standpoint. But I think it all starts at the business processes. And I think that if you start at the business processes, you get rid of a lot of that other stuff, and you can kind of figure out where your best path is.
I got a question. So those are big, complex type situations, application by application. It seems to me, do you folks have the resources within the FDA and GSA and the agencies to do it yourself, or is this where systems integrators really can come in and help you guys and partners and that sort of thing?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. We need system integrators to come in, but we have to take on some of this mess ourselves, right, because we created this mess, and it really goes to that interoperability and system duplication issue. We have to know what we have out there. We have to know what our high value assets are. We have to know what data is moderate, what data is low, and what data is high. And you have to break all that down, and then you have to run it through that criteria. Is this a good candidate for the cloud? Is this something that could reduce O&M if we give self-provisioning a try here? Or can we save more money by signing this contract to move the work into the cloud, and then we can stop signing this contract for the on-site support? And so there's indirect costs associated with every one of those decisions. So I'm gonna task my procurement people either way. So I can't tell my procurement people by going to the cloud there's going to be less work, because they know that it's just going to be a different kind of work. But I think that if you evaluate that on-premise and you really look at it, you'll find the sweet spot in every one of those cases. It gets more challenging when you look at that global picture. Looking at one application at a time is not a problem. Looking at the duplicative applications, that's not a problem. It's that transformation that gets complex.
And so Dave, to that question about do agencies have that expertise resident, that kind of the bandwidth, there is no one template for what we see in agencies. Agencies really come in many different places, and so with GSA, for example, we have our technology transformation service, which has H&F. Often they can engage with an agency to help them even gather their thinking about how to move forward and what it even means to make a digital transformation. Whereas we have some agencies who come to us who really have a clear picture and a clear roadmap of where they need to be and how they're going to get there, and what they're looking for is more of that direct connection and faster connection to the suppliers who could provide them with those types of services. So really throughout our service offerings, we really try to make sure that we're able to support any agency depending upon where they're coming in. But often we always try to make sure that, just as Todd was saying, is that they have that clear thinking in and around their strategy for how they're going to move forward.
So one of the things that we see in our space is that there's a lot of players out there who are really power ping pipe. Tell me how many, and I can give you a quote and that sort of thing. But what we're starting to see and where we're trying to move to is this solutions approach, where you can bring together the various forms of cloud, whether it's a public multi-tenant, whether it's a private cloud, whether it's simple co-location, but also bringing to the table the architectural skills and those types of things to sit down with your folks and basically, okay, this is the way your application is written. Let's figure out this together. Let's throw up a proof of concept or something like that. It's a much different way to approach the space from companies like myself, and I think that that's something, as you guys try to evaluate, it's something you really need to ask for.
And Dave, that's exactly how we're viewing it. Again, you may have somebody who comes in and they're just looking to fill out the pieces in their overall puzzle, and in that way it's much more commoditized that they're looking to procure these different services. But more often than not, what folks are looking for is not to have to figure out for themselves how to kludge together an overall solution, but that assistance in really saying, how do we get to an elegant overall solution that allows us to carry out and execute on our plan as opposed to buying the commodity pieces?
Yeah, let me try to make this a little more specific. Some commercial industries that have big legacy systems, retail and so on, the way they have approached digital services is to extract the data that is tied to those legacy applications, which is a technical feat in itself, because in the old model, the databases and the applications, are all tied together within a mainframe type of system. But if you can get the data out, then you can do all kinds of things in a front end for customers, and the customers aren't really hitting your mainframes and your legacy applications. They're hitting something you have deployed in a cloud, I would think. And then there's a synchronization that happens in the back end that's not anything to do with the public, everything to do with your data center, and the cloud is kind of the broker, if you will, between that new front end with digital services and the legacy in the back. Is that a viable model for government, and is what they're doing now?
Yeah, and we've seen that happen. I'm going to go back to what Todd said about his advisory board. I think that's exactly the kind of question his advisory board would likely try to tackle, is what's the best approach to getting us to this endpoint. On the other hand, I've heard Renee Wynn, the CIO at NASA, talk about, we have systems that are COBOL-based systems that are out there, been around for decades and for years, and honestly, she said that she's not going to invest the time, money, and resources to modernize those because they have a natural end of life. It's stuff floating around in space. We know what its mission is. We know when it's going to end. There's no reason to expend the energies in modernizing it. So I think it's not necessarily one size fits all, but having the sounding board or the ability to say for each of these, and from that more global perspective, how do we want to approach this? But what you've described is a very common approach.
Are we seeing it in the federal government, though?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
We're definitely seeing that in the federal government. What you just described, it is the paradigm shift that's occurring. We're moving from these traditional data warehouses where you needed a schema going in. You mentioned the databases and you needed to know that structure. and we don't care anymore. Big data is very different. And so you were spot on. I just want to say that. I agree with you. You're-
Sort of make sure.
Yeah, so some of the big cloud providers, they recognize, and we, companies like myself, we not only work with the agencies, but we also work with the major cloud providers as well, right? So one of the things that they're very interested in is the stuff that you're saying is the front end, right? They've got that, right? They want to get that access to the mainframe stuff, right? And they're trying to figure out how to go after that. And I think it also comes down to is the type of data that they're also interested in going after, right? I think that from unclassified workloads, pretty easy to put up in the cloud, that sort of thing. It's how do we move to the classified workloads, and how do we modernize, and how do we gain all the efficiencies that cloud can provide when you're dealing in the classified space is, I think, the next frontier that companies like myself, and I'm sure agencies like yours, are very interested in trying to solve those riddles.
Well, I would say even before classified, there's a much larger body which agencies are struggling with, and that is controlled unclassified information, which FDA has in probably petabytes worth, and many, many agencies do. It's not for public consumption, but it's also not classified, but it's very large volumes, and agencies are struggling how to classify it in the first place. I say classify, that is put what classification should be on it. But that CUI is a big area, and I think FedRAMP might be headed that direction.
And they are headed in that direction, because this is a struggle for agencies, because not only all those characteristics that you just mentioned, but that information is the engine for driving their mission critical systems and their mission critical operations. And so there is that hesitancy of letting it go someplace that is not within a facility. And I do think until we really tackle that, I think in some ways industry is starting to meet us halfway there, and the idea that a lot of these cloud service providers are recognizing that we may be willing to move to a multi-tenant environment, but for the fact we don't want those other tenants to not be subject to the same kind of controls and the same kinds of conditions that we are, and so they have moved to having facilities available that are government only, where they could get that FedRAMP certification. They could get that at that FedRAMP, not just that FedRAMP moderate, but that FedRAMP high as well, so that option is there for agencies. So I think industry moving in that direction, as well as the maturity of kind of the advanced maturity of agencies and knowing and understanding how to protect it and moving it into that environment, and also being able to move it back out of that environment.
I think the other place that industry can help the federal government is for the agencies that have OCONUS needs, right? So that's a huge untapped area that, while you might be able to hit the government-focused clouds here in the U.S., if you're trying to hit some of these clouds from Europe, the latency is going to kill you, right? So how do you handle forward deployed, whether it's for the DoD or for Department of State or some of these agencies that are all over the world, how do you handle some of those unique requirements? And I think that as these agencies are making these decisions, U.S. is easy. We can solve that. But it's when we start to go outside the borders that things get a little trickier. But do you really want to run 2 email systems if you're the DoD, right? I mean, how do you can handle CONUS, how do you handle OCONUS? And I think that that's where industry can provide a lot of value, right?
Yeah, it's little known that FDA has inspectors all over the world.
Yes.
And more now than there were years ago. So what do you do for them, the mobile people, if you will?
Well, security certainly becomes a challenge when they're abroad. And we've actually implemented some really sophisticated solutions lately to make our inspectors in China and other countries more secure. But we haven't really leveraged the cloud very much in those solutions. Most of those solutions were very tactical. How do we get equipment in and out of the embassies? How do we, get these people working and get their data back to us safely and securely? So I haven't had a lot of cloud successes on that level.
We'll have to take that to the board and see what they say for the next round. And another question, while we have time left, I wanted to explore was mobility, because that's a big issue for everybody, including federal agencies, as both the constituents come at federal agencies with mobile devices. I think the tipping point has occurred for government, where there's more hits to websites and transactions from mobile devices now than through desktop devices. I think it already happened for the rest of the world. And so mobility is big, and for federal users themselves. Mobility is, everybody's got 3 devices nowadays. And so how does the cloud mitigate the issues of mobility management and data control and all of those good things?
I think we could even broaden the aperture on that a little bit more and talk about the nature of end user computing and what's the form factor that are in use. And I do think that as we move,
the architecture, if you will.
as we move more into this as a service world, you're seeing more and more that what agencies are looking for is not necessarily to define very narrowly and make a commodity buy of a particular technology, but that idea that they are looking for an end user computing platforms that are fully managed by providers, where they have those options to be able to evolve those over time, and includes mobility because of that recognition that they either have a workforce that is out there in the field, if you will, or that the design is going to, the business design is going to change over time. So I think in one way it's just that the thinking is evolving, and it's including kind of the end user computing device kind of in that overall delivery of service, not necessarily as a separate entity. We actually do have there's a government-wide mobile services category team that's actively looking at kind of the future of mobility, looking at things like derived credentials. You can't have a mobile device with a big add-on to put your PIV card in it. So they're looking at tackling a lot of those things that start to become a complicator for that.
But kind of cloud naturals for derived credentials, for example.
So I think part and parcel to that are going to be cloud-based solutions to help in solving that overall, where are we moving with end user computing and kind of the form factor that folks use.
I think that from our perspective, from industry, mobility and the next one is IoT are going to be the two things that really drive our demand in our space. When you look at Northern Virginia, the center of the data center world, 46 new sites coming up. The last 100 megawatts that was put into Ashburn was for phones, right? The next 300 is going to be for IoT. And I think as the federal government starts to look at IoT and how you handle when a piece part in a federal government needs to talk back to a federally compliant data center, these are the types of challenges that we're going to get into very, very quickly.
And we'll have to get to those another day. Great questions. I want to thank today's guest today. Bill Zielinski is the Deputy Assistant Commissioner for IT Category Management at the General Services Administration. Todd Simpson is the Chief Information Officer at the Food and Drug Administration. And Dave McComber is the Executive Vice President of the Public Sector and Federal at QTS. I'm Tom Temin, Federal News Radio 1500 AM. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsradio.com, keyword QTS.
On behalf of QTS, thank you for joining us. A link to the archived sessions will be sent to you shortly. If you requested a training certificate, you will also receive an email with download instructions after the webinar. This concludes our discussion. Thank you.